My name is Chelsea Williams. I'm 32 years old, and 10 minutes ago, I was the wife of a billionaire. Now I'm just a woman standing in a gold silk dress, holding a divorce petition and the deed to a rotting shack in the middle of nowhere. My husband thinks he just took everything. He has no idea he just handed me his downfall. The air in the ballroom smelled of expensive lilies and desperation. I adjusted the strap of my gold silk gown, the one Mark had picked out because it complemented his tie, and tried to force a smile for the cameras. This was the Chicago Children's Hospital Gala, the event of the year, and as the wife of Mark Williams, I was expected to be the perfect accessory. "Keep that chin up, Chelsea," Mark whispered, his hand gripping my waist just a little too tight. "The Tribune photographer is looking this way. Look like you're actually happy to be here." "I'm trying, Mark," I murmured, my voice lost in the swell of the string quartet. "But I haven't seen you for 3 nights. We need to talk about—" "Not now," he snapped, his smile never wavering as he nodded toward a senator across the room. "We discuss business at home. Tonight, you're a Williams. Act like it." He didn't mean my feelings. He meant the business of our marriage, which had felt more like a hostile takeover for the last 6 months. I had spent 10 years building his image, designing the interiors of his corporate offices to look approachable yet dominant, and scrubbing the rough edges off his blue-collar past. I was the designer. He was the brand. A man in a cheap charcoal gray suit, someone who definitely didn't belong at a $5,000 a plate dinner, approached us. I thought he was a confused guest until he reached into his breast pocket. "Mark Williams?" the man asked. "Not now, pal," Mark said, dismissive. "I'm not for you, sir," the man said, turning to me. His eyes held a flicker of pity that made my stomach drop. "Chelsea Williams, you've been served." He pressed a thick, cold envelope into my hand. The world went silent. The clinking of crystal and the hum of 100 conversations seemed to vanish, replaced by the loud, rhythmic thumping of blood in my ears. I looked down. The bold heading of the first page screamed through the plastic window of the envelope, "Petition for Dissolution of Marriage." I looked at Mark. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't angry. He was checking his watch. "Timing's a bit dramatic, even for my legal team," Mark said, finally letting go of my waist. He took a sip of his champagne, looking at me as if I were a piece of furniture he had decided to put in storage. "But I suppose it saves us the talk you wanted so badly." "You're doing this here?" I whispered, my voice lost in the swell of the string quartet. "But I haven't seen you for 3 nights. We need to talk about—" "Not now," he snapped, his smile never wavering as he nodded toward a senator across the room. "We discuss business at home. Tonight, you're a Williams. Act like it." He didn't mean my feelings. He meant the business of our marriage, which had felt more like a hostile takeover for the last 6 months. I had spent 10 years building his image, designing the interiors of his corporate offices to look approachable yet dominant, and scrubbing the rough edges off his blue-collar past. I was the designer. He was the brand. A man in a cheap charcoal gray suit, someone who definitely didn't belong at a $5,000 a plate dinner, approached us. The conference room on the 54th floor was a cage of glass and polished chrome. Outside, the Chicago skyline was blurred by a gray drizzle, matching the coldness inside. I sat across from Mark and a phalanx of 3 lawyers who looked like they had been carved out of granite. My own lawyer, a sympathetic woman named Sarah, squeezed my hand under the table, but even she knew we were walking into an ambush. "Let's be clear, Chelsea," Mark said, leaning back in his leather chair. He had treated his tuxedo for a charcoal power suit. He looked refreshed, while I felt like I was held together by caffeine and spite. You signed a post-nuptial agreement 3 years ago, you remember? During the rebranding phase? I signed it because you said it was for the investors, I said, my voice hoarse. You said it was a formality to protect the company's IPO. And it was, Mark replied with a thin, sharp smile. And the company is me. Everything you designed, the logos, the office layouts, the furniture lines, was done under the umbrella of Williams Global. You were an employee, Chelsea, a very well-compensated one. One of his lawyers pushed a stack of papers toward me. The scent of fresh toner and expensive stationery filled the air. The penthouse? I asked, looking at Sarah. The leased by the corporation, the lead lawyer barked. You have 48 hours to vacate. The joint accounts? Drained into offshore holdings prior to the filing. Sarah whispered beside me, her voice tight with frustration. He played the long game, Chelsea. He's been moving assets for 18 months. I felt a cold sweat prickle at the back of my neck. I looked at Mark. This was the man I had shared a bed with for 10 years, the man I had encouraged when he was just a middle manager with a dream. Now he was looking at me like I was a budget deficit he was finally correcting. So what's left? I asked, my heart hammering against my ribs. Mark sighed as if he were bored. I'm not a monster. I'm giving you a start. There's $5,000 in a checking account opened in your name this morning, and, he paused, a mocking glint in his eyes, I'm letting you keep that eyesore in Connecticut, the one your grandmother Abigail left you. The farmhouse? I blinked. You hated that place. You called it a glorified shack in the woods. It is, Mark laughed, a dry, hollow sound, which is why I didn't bother putting it in the corporate name. It's a tax liability, a drafty, rotting pile of wood in the middle of nowhere. It's perfect for you, really. You love vintage, don't you? Now you can live in it. He stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. His lawyers snapped their briefcases shut in unison, a sound like a firing squad. $5,000 and a shack? I whispered, looking at the deed he had slid across the table. It was yellowed and smelled of cedar and old dust. Don't spend it all in one place, Mark said, pausing at the door. Oh, and Chelsea, don't bother calling. I've already changed my number. I'm moving on to bigger things. I suggest you do the same, if you can find your way out of the woods. As the door clicked shut, the silence in the room felt heavier than the penthouse. I clutched the deed to my chest. It was the only thing I had left in the world, a piece of paper and a memory of a grandmother who always told me that the most beautiful things were often hidden under the surface. The drive from Chicago to Connecticut was a blur of roadside diners and gas station coffee that tasted like burnt plastic. My sleek silver SUV had been seized by the corporation, so I was behind the wheel of a rusted 10-year-old sedan I'd bought for $3,000 of my remaining $5,000. Every time the engine rattled, my heart skipped a beat. By the time I reached the outskirts of the small town near the farmhouse, the sun was dipping below the jagged line of the Berkshire Mountains, bleeding a deep, bruised purple across the sky. I pulled onto a gravel path so overgrown that the branches of oak trees clawed at my windows like skeletal fingers. Then, there it was, Great Oak Farm. It looked worse than I remembered. The white paint was peeling in long, curling strips, looking like the skin of a shedding snake. The porch groaned under my boots like an old man with bad knees, and the air here didn't smell like Chicago's exhaust and expensive perfume. It smelled of damp earth, pine needles, and the heavy, sweet scent of decay. "Welcome home, Chelsea," I whispered, the sound of my own voice startling a crow from the gutter. I fumbled with the rusted key. The lock resisted, stubborn and stiff, until finally, with a piercing screech, the door gave way. I stepped inside and coughed. The dust was a physical weight, dancing in the beam of my flashlight. Mark's words echoed in my head, a drafty, rotting pile of wood. The living room was a graveyard of furniture covered in gray sheets. I pulled one back, releasing a cloud of mothballs and history. Beneath it was a velvet armchair, its deep emerald fabric hidden under years of neglect. I sat down, and the springs gave a weary sigh. I was 32 years old, and my entire life was currently contained in a single suitcase on a dusty floor. I wanted to cry. I wanted to scream until my lungs burned, but the silence of the house was too heavy to break. I spent the next hour wandering through the rooms, my flashlight cutting through the gloom. Mark had called this place junk-filled, but as I looked at the hand-carved crown molding and the wide planked cherry floors hidden under grime, the designer in me began to stir. Mark saw a liability. I saw bones, strong, beautiful bones. In the kitchen, I found a stack of cardboard boxes tucked under a heavy oak table. They were labeled in Grandmother Abigail's elegant looping script, "For the one who sees." Inside weren't just old dishes. There were leather-bound journals, rolls of thick parchment, and heavy iron skeleton keys. I pulled out a journal and flipped it open. A loose scrap of paper fell out. It was a hand-drawn map of the property, dated 1920. My eyes followed the lines of the map, tracing the boundary of the great oak estate. My breath hitched. There was a section highlighted in red, a narrow strip of land that extended far beyond the current fence line, cutting deep into the valley, where the new highway had just been built. I looked out the window toward the valley. In the distance, I could see the skeletal cranes of a massive construction site. That was Mark's project, his Legacy Heights. I looked back at the map, then at the deed Mark had practically thrown at me. A strange, cold shiver raced down my spine. Mark had been so eager to strip me of the future that he hadn't bothered to look at what was buried in the past. The first week at the farmhouse was a blur of sore muscles and bleach. I traded my silk slips for flannel shirts and heavy denim. My hands, once perfectly manicured for gripping champagne flutes, were now red raw and smelled of pine sol. It was the best I had felt in years. Every layer of dust I scrubbed away felt like I was peeling Mark's influence off my soul. On Tuesday morning, the silence was broken by the distant, rhythmic thud, thud, thud of a pile driver from the valley. I stood on the back porch, a mug of bitter coffee in my hands, watching the yellow cranes of Legacy Heights crawl across the horizon like mechanical insects. Mark was out there, building his monument to himself. I headed to the basement to check the old boiler. The air down there was different. Colder, smelling of wet stone and ancient secrets. As I moved a stack of rotting cedar planks, my flashlight caught something odd. The shadows on the far wall didn't line up. I'm an interior designer. I spent a decade obsessed with symmetry and structural integrity. The foundation of this house was fieldstone, but a 4-foot section near the coal chute was made of mismatched brick, plastered over with crumbling mortar. I tapped it with the back of my hammer. Clink, clink, hollow. My heart began to race. I found a crowbar in the corner and jammed it into a hairline crack in the mortar. With a grunt of effort that made my shoulders ache, I pried. A chunk of plaster fell away, hitting the floor with a dry puff of dust. Behind it wasn't more stone. It was a small, recessed cavity lined with rusted tin. Inside sat a heavy, lead-lined box. It felt like it weighed 50 pounds. I hauled it up to the kitchen table, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I pried the lid open. My nose was met with the sharp, acidic scent of old ink and preservation wax. Inside were rolls of blue-tinted parchment, original architectural surveys of the county from the 1920s. I unrolled the largest one, weighting the corners with salt shakers. It was a master survey of the valley. There, in faded white lines, was Great Oak Farm. And there, cutting directly through the center of what was now the Legacy Heights construction site, was a narrow 10-foot-wide corridor of land. I pulled out a second document. It was a right-of-way deed, unsigned by the county, but stamped by the state Supreme Court. It stated that this specific strip of land, the Abigail Access, remained private property in perpetuity, regardless of surrounding development, to allow for the transport of timber. I sat back, the chair creaking under me. I knew exactly what this meant. In the world of high-stakes real estate, a 10-foot strip of land in the middle of a skyscraper footprint was a kill switch. If you didn't own it, you couldn't build over it. You couldn't even put a sidewalk there. Mark had been so obsessed with the future, his shiny glass towers, that he hadn't bothered to check the worthless past. He had handed me the deed to his own destruction. I looked at the $500 left in my bank account. It wasn't enough to fight a legal war, but it was enough to buy a very large, very sturdy fence. The local hardware store owner, a man named Silas, who looked like he'd been carved from a piece of weathered hickory, stared at my order. "That's a lot of industrial-grade fencing for a vegetable garden, Miss Williams." "I'm protecting a very specific asset, Silas," I said, sliding my last few $100s across the counter. I spent the next 3 days in the valley. The noise from the Legacy Heights site was deafening, the roar of bulldozers and the shouts of men in neon vests. They were clearing the perimeter, just 50 yards from where my property line officially ended, or where they thought it ended. Using the old surveys and a rented GPS transit, I found the rusted iron stakes buried under decades of leaf litter. I didn't hire a crew. I did it myself. I hammered the heavy steel posts into the earth, my palms blistering and my blonde hair tied back in a messy, sweat-soaked knot. I ran thick, galvanized wire between the posts, creating a narrow, 10-foot-wide pen that stretched directly across the path where their main access road was supposed to be. I finished by hanging a series of bright red signs: "Private property, no trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted." I was sitting on the tailgate of my rusted sedan, wiping grease from my forehead, when the first white SUV roared up the dirt track. A man in a tailored suit and a hard hat hopped out, looking annoyed. "Hey, you can't park here," he shouted over the sound of a nearby generator. "This is a construction zone." "Actually," I said, standing up and dusting off my jeans, "you're the one trespassing. You're standing on my driveway." He laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Lady, I'm the site manager for Williams Global. This is Legacy Heights property. Move the car and take down this, whatever this is." "I'm Chelsea Williams," I said, stepping closer, "and if you check the county records for the Abigail Access, you'll find that this 10-foot strip belongs to me, which means your bulldozers are currently blocking my right-of-way. I'd suggest you move them before I call the sheriff." The man's face went from annoyed to pale in 3 seconds. He looked at the fence, then at the GPS coordinates I had marked on the posts. He pulled out a radio. "Get the legal team on the line, now. We have a situation." 2 hours later, the heavy machinery fell silent. The sudden quiet was more jarring than the noise. I stood my ground as a black town car kicked up a cloud of dust, screeched to a halt, and Mark stepped out. He didn't look like the victor from the Chicago ballroom anymore. His tie was loosened, and his face was flushed with a dangerous shade of red. "Chelsea?" he barked, stomping toward the wire fence. What the hell is this pathetic little stunt? You're blocking the primary entrance for the crane delivery. Do you have any idea how much every hour of delay is costing me? I imagine it's more than $5,000, Mark, which is a shame, really. You should have been more careful with your tax liabilities. Mark gripped the wire, his knuckles white. I gave you that house out of pity. If you think you can shake me down for a few bucks, you're crazier than your grandmother. My lawyers will have this fence torn down by sunset. They can try, I replied calmly, pulling a laminated copy of the 1920 Supreme Court stamp from my pocket. But this isn't a zoning dispute, Mark. This is a clouded title on the very heart of your project. No bank will fund a skyscraper that has a private corridor running through the lobby. You're not just delayed, you're stuck. For the first time in 10 years, I saw a flicker of genuine fear in Mark's eyes. He looked at the worthless strip of land, then back at me, the woman he thought he had destroyed. "What do you want?" he hissed. "I'm not ready to talk terms yet. I have a lot of vintage junk to sort through at the house. Don't call me, I'll call you." The silence in the valley was a victory song. Without the roar of the bulldozers, I could finally hear the wind whispering through the ancient oaks. But I knew I couldn't just sit on a fence post and wait for Mark to crumble. I needed a foundation of my own. I turned my attention to the junk. I spent days in the barn, which was filled with architectural salvage Grandmother Abigail had collected over 40 years. There were hand-carved fireplace mantels, stained glass windows from demolished cathedrals, and brass hardware that shone like dull gold once I rubbed away the grime. I dragged the emerald velvet armchair into the light of the porch. My hands, now calloused and steady, moved with a purpose I had forgotten. I stripped the old varnish off the cherry wood legs, revealing a grain so deep and rich it looked like liquid amber. I cleaned the velvet with gentle strokes until the green vibrated against the white-peeled porch. I took a photo of it against the backdrop of the misty Connecticut hills and posted it online. Great Oak Restorations, piece number 1. By the end of the week, my phone, the cheap burner I'd bought, wouldn't stop buzzing. It wasn't just local collectors, it was designers from New York and Boston, people who recognized the Abigail collection for what it was, a treasure trove of American history. "You're sitting on a gold mine, Chelsea," Silas said, dropping off a crate of specialized wood wax. He looked at the barn, now glowing with polished wood and brass. Mark was a fool. He only knows how to build things with glass and cold steel. He forgot that people want things with a soul. The soul of my new business was growing, but the ghost of my old life wasn't done haunting me. A sleek black sedan, different from the one before, pulled into the gravel drive. A woman stepped out. She was tall, wearing a suit that cost more than my car, and carrying a leather briefcase like a weapon. Mark's fixer. "Ms. Williams," she said, not bothering with a smile, "I'm Elena Vance, representing Williams Global. I'm here to offer you a settlement, $1 million for the Abigail Access, and a non-disclosure agreement regarding the difficulties of the last few weeks." $1 million. It was more money than I had ever seen in my own name. It could buy a condo in the city, a new life, a way out. I looked at the emerald chair. I looked at the barn. Then I looked past her, down to the valley where Mark's legacy heights sat like a dead giant in the mud. $1 million? I asked, wiping a smudge of grease onto my apron. "It's a very generous offer for a strip of dirt," Elena said, her eyes scanning the peeling paint of the house with disdain. "It is," I agreed, "but I've been doing some math. Every day those cranes sit idle, Mark loses $200,000 in investor penalties. The steel contracts are expiring. The unions are threatening to walk. In 5 days, $1 million won't even cover his interest payments. I stepped off the porch, standing eye to eye with her. Tell Mark I'm not interested in his money. I'm an interior designer, remember? And I've decided I don't like the interior of his project. It's too crowded. It's blocking my view. What are you saying? Elena asked, her composure finally cracking. I'm saying the price just went up, and it's not something you can write a check for. The rain began as a drizzle and turned into a downpour that turned the Connecticut soil into a thick, red soup. I was in the barn, the scent of cedar shavings and linseed oil thick in the air, working on a mid-century sideboard. The rhythmic scrape of my sander was the only sound until the crunch of gravel signaled a visitor. I didn't even look up when the car door slammed. I knew that heavy, arrogant stride anywhere. Mark stepped into the barn. He looked like a man who had been through a war. His $3,000 suit was splattered with mud at the hems, and his hair, usually plastered into a perfect wave, was wild and damp. He looked around the barn, his eyes landing on the restored furniture, the antique hardware, and finally on me. You look like a common laborer, Chelsea, he said, his voice straining for its usual condescending edge, but his hands were shaking. I am a laborer, Mark, I said, setting the sander down and wiping my hands on my apron. I'm building something. It's a concept you used to understand. Enough of the poetry, he barked, his voice echoing off the rafters. Legacy Heights is hemorrhaging money. My investors are breathing down my neck. They're talking about breach of contract. Do you know what that means? They'll strip me of everything I worked for. You mean everything we worked for, I corrected him quietly. He stepped closer, his shadow falling over my workbench. Fine, you want a piece of the pie? I'll give you $5 million. $5 million, Chelsea. You can buy 10 of these shacks. You can go back to Chicago and live like a queen. Just sign the easement and let me move my cranes. I looked at the wood in front of me. It was a beautiful piece of white oak, strong and steady. You still think this is about the money, I said, looking him dead in the eye. That's your fatal flaw, Mark. You think everyone has a price because you do. Everyone does have a price, he screamed. I already made a phone call, Mark, but not to your lawyers. I walked over to the barn door and pointed toward the valley. A small, unassuming white van was parked near my fence line. That's the State Historical Commission. I spent the last week digging through Grandmother Abigail's journals. It turns out this shack and the Abigail Access weren't just for timber. They were part of a pre-revolutionary supply route. Mark's face went from red to a ghostly, sickly white. I filed for historical landmark status, I continued, my voice calm and unwavering. And because your project requires the structural alteration of a protected historical corridor, the state has issued a permanent injunction. You can't build your lobby there. You can't build your entrance there. In fact, you can't build anything within 50 feet of that strip of dirt. You killed it, he whispered, his knees buckling slightly. He slumped against a stack of raw timber. The project is dead. I'm ruined. I didn't kill it, Mark. Your greed did. You were so busy trying to take everything from me that you forgot to check if the nothing you left me was actually the foundation of your entire empire. He looked up at me, and for a second I saw the man I had married, the man who had nothing but a dream. But that man was gone, replaced by a hollow shell of corporate ambition. I'm not going back to Chicago, Mark, I said.
gesturing to the thriving workshop around me. "I've already partnered with Harrison Vance, your biggest rival. He's funding the restoration of this estate into a premier design school and historical site. I'm the creative director. I kept the foundation. You just kept the debt." Mark didn't say another word. He turned and walked out into the rain, his shoulders slumped, looking small against the vast, enduring canopy of the great oaks.
6 months later, the air in Connecticut didn't smell like damp rot or desperation. It smelled of fresh white paint, lavender, and the crisp, clean promise of autumn. I stood on the wraparound porch of Great Oak, leaning against a railing that I had sanded and stained myself. The house was no longer a shack. It was a masterpiece of federal-style architecture, its white siding gleaming against the fiery oranges and reds of the turning maples. In the valley below, the skeletal cranes of Legacy Heights were gone. After the historical injunction, the investors had fled like rats from a sinking ship. The concrete foundation Mark had poured was being broken up and hauled away, replaced by a lush green meadow that would eventually become the Abigail Williams Historical Park. I checked my tablet. The morning's news was full of it. Williams Global files for Chapter 11. Mark had lost the Chicago penthouse, the offshore accounts, and the fleet of cars. The brand he had sacrificed his soul to build was being sold off in pieces to pay back the creditors he had lied to. I heard he was living in a small one-bedroom apartment in a suburb he used to mock, working as a consultant for a mid-level firm. He had taken everything in the divorce, but because he didn't value the nothing he left me with, he ended up with exactly what he gave: 0. A car pulled up the gravel drive, not a black sedan, but a modest, sturdy truck. Silas hopped out, carrying a box of brass hinges for the new guest wing. "Morning, Chelsea," he called out with a grin. "Saw your feature in Architectural Digest this morning. The Queen of Restoration, they're calling you." I laughed, the sound light and easy. "I think I prefer the woman who kept the dirt, Silas." "Whatever you call it, it's working," he said, nodding toward the barn. 3 young designers, students from the new apprenticeship program I'd started with Harrison Vance, were busy unloading a shipment of salvaged heart pine. They looked at the house with the same awe I used to have before Mark turned my passion into a corporate spreadsheet. I walked down the porch steps, the sun catching my hair. For the first time in my life, I wasn't an accessory or a consultant. I was the architect of my own existence. I looked at the narrow strip of land, the Abigail Access, that still cut through the valley. It wasn't just a legal loophole anymore. It was a reminder. A foundation isn't made of money or power or glass towers that scrape the sky. It's made of the things you refuse to give up. It's made of the history that shaped you and the resilience that saves you. Mark thought he won because he walked away with the gold. He never realized that gold is just metal. I walked away with the soil, the soul, and the secret. And as I watched my students start their day's work, I realized he was right about one thing. He did take the future. He took a future that was hollow and cold. I kept the past, and I used it to build a world he'll never be able to touch.